On March 15, 2021, the arrest that shattered Bozeman, Montana wasn't captured by news cameras or announced with fanfare. Instead, it happened quietly at 6:47 a.m. in the parking lot of Roosevelt Elementary School, where 68-year-old William Hendricks had just finished setting up orange cones for the morning drop-off zone. The beloved crossing guard, known for his gentle waves and pocketful of stickers, offered no resistance as Detective Lisa Chen read him his rights for the murder of Sarah Mitchell, a name that had haunted this mountain town for 34 years. But to understand how that morning rewrote everything Bozeman thought it knew about itself, we have to go back to February 14, 1987, when the first snowflakes of what would become a record-breaking blizzard began falling on Main Street. If you've followed cases like this before, you know how crucial these early details become, so make sure you're subscribed, because the evidence we'll uncover gets more disturbing with each layer. Sarah Mitchell had always been punctual. At 19, she possessed the reliability that made Rosie's Diner on North 7th Avenue depend on her for the closing shift, especially on Valentine's Day, when couples lingered over coffee and pie until well past normal hours. Her manager, Helen Kowalski, would later tell investigators that Sarah seemed distracted that evening, checking the wall clock more frequently than usual and glancing toward the frost-covered windows where snow had begun accumulating on the sills. The last customer left at 10:23 p.m. Helen remembered this precisely because she'd made a joke about Valentine's Day ending early, and Sarah had managed only a weak smile in response. By 10:45, the register was balanced, chairs stacked on tables and the coffee pots cleaned. Helen watched Sarah pull her burgundy wool coat tight around her shoulders before stepping into the February night, her breath creating small clouds in the frigid air. Sarah's car, a 1983 Honda Civic with a rust spot above the rear wheel well that she'd been meaning to fix, sat alone in the employee parking area behind the diner. The vehicle had been a high school graduation gift from her parents, and despite its cosmetic flaws, it had never failed to start, even in Montana's brutal winters. What happened in the 60 feet between Rosie's back door and that Honda would consume the next 3 decades of questions. At 11:47 p.m., Jeremy Walsh was driving home from his job at the lumber mill when his headlights swept across something that made him press the brake pedal harder than he intended. Sarah's Honda sat running in the middle of County Road 86, 3 miles north of town, its driver's side door hanging open like a mouth-frozen mid-scream. The heater was running full blast, and the radio played softly, KBOZ's late-night country classics that Sarah had always preferred. Her brown leather purse remained on the passenger seat, wallet intact, along with the tips she'd counted twice that evening, $43.67 in crumpled bills and coins. Jeremy would later struggle to explain the sensation that washed over him as he approached the abandoned vehicle. The silence felt wrong, he told sheriff's investigators, as if the darkness itself was holding its breath. Sarah's coat lay crumpled on the driver's seat, still warm to the touch, and her keys dangled from the ignition. The only evidence of struggle was a single scuff mark in the snow beside the open door, and her left shoe, a brown leather flat she'd bought specifically because it was comfortable for long shifts, discovered 15 feet away, partially buried beneath the accumulating snowfall. Sheriff Tom Bradley had been elected to his position based more on his softball coaching record than his investigative experience, and the disappearance of Sarah Mitchell exposed every gap in Gallatin County's law enforcement capabilities. With the department of 8 officers covering 2,600 square miles, Bradley found himself managing the most complex case in the county's modern history, with resources better suited for cattle rustling and bar fights. The first 24 hours proved crucial in ways that wouldn't become apparent until decades later. Deputy Mark Stevens, fresh from a community college criminal justice program, arrived at the scene 47 minutes after Jeremy Walsh's 911 call. In the falling snow and darkness, Stevens made decisions that would haunt the investigation forever. He allowed Jeremy to drive the Honda back to town, inadvertently contaminating potential evidence. The scuff mark in the snow disappeared under continued snowfall before it could be photographed, and the 26-degree temperature made preserving tire impressions nearly impossible. Sarah's parents, Richard and Patricia Mitchell, arrived at the sheriff's station at 1:15 a.m., having driven through increasingly treacherous conditions after receiving Bradley's phone call. Patricia, a mathematics teacher at Bozeman High School, immediately began constructing timelines and lists with the methodical precision she applied to lesson plans. Richard, who managed the parts department at Morrison Motors, approached the crisis with mechanical logic, asking about search procedures and communication protocols. Neither parent could comprehend how their daughter could simply vanish from a car that showed no signs of mechanical failure or forced entry. The initial search focused on the area around County Road 86, hampered by the worst February storm in 15 years. Volunteer search parties struggled through snowdrifts that reached 4 feet in some areas, calling Sarah's name into a landscape that seemed to swallow sound itself. Hunting dogs brought from Missoula lost the scent trail within hours, confused by the storm and the contaminated scene. By February 18th, Bradley faced pressure from multiple directions. The local newspaper, the Bozeman Daily Chronicle, ran daily front-page stories questioning the department's competence. Parents refused to let their daughters work evening shifts, and the tourism industry worried about negative publicity. Bradley needed a suspect, and he found one in Danny Kowalski, Helen's 22-year-old son, who had dated Sarah briefly the previous summer. Danny became the focus of an investigation driven more by desperation than evidence. His on-again, off-again relationship with Sarah provided motive. His knowledge of her work schedule created opportunity, and his presence at Murphy's Bar until closing time on Valentine's Day offered an alibi that couldn't be definitively proven. Under relentless questioning, Danny's story contained minor inconsistencies that Bradley's inexperienced team interpreted as deception. The fact that Danny had been seen arguing with Sarah outside the diner in January became central to the prosecution's theory. The arrest came on March 3rd, accompanied by local media coverage that presumed guilt. Danny's family hired a public defender from Helena who seemed overwhelmed by the case's complexity. The preliminary hearing revealed the weakness of the state's evidence. No physical proof linking Danny to the abandoned vehicle, no witnesses placing him on County Road 86, and no body. But in a town demanding answers, reasonable doubt felt like an inadequate defense against community outrage. The charges against Danny collapsed in July 1987 when his alibi was corroborated by newly discovered security footage from Murphy's Bar. But the damage to both Danny and the investigation proved irreversible. Public confidence in the sheriff's department evaporated, and potential witnesses, already hesitant to come forward, retreated further into silence. Sarah Mitchell's case joined the growing stack of unsolved files in Bradley's office, where it would remain untouched for the next 16 years. Patricia Mitchell's basement became a shrine to obsession, its concrete walls lined with bankers' boxes labeled in her precise handwriting. Witness statements 1987, 1992. Physical evidence photos. Timeline discrepancies. Madhu, the mathematics teacher who had once organized her classroom with color-coded filing systems, now applied that same methodical approach to her daughter's disappearance, transforming the space beneath her ranch-style home into an investigative command center that would consume the next 34 years of her life. Every evening after grading papers and preparing lessons, Patricia descended those 13 wooden steps to continue her real work. The basement smelled of old cardboard and developing solution from the photographs she'd printed herself. unwilling to trust anyone else with the images that might hold the key to Sarah's fate. Under fluorescent lights that hummed with electrical persistence, she spread evidence across a folding table purchased specifically for this purpose, examining each piece with the magnifying glass Richard had bought her for their 20th wedding anniversary. The wall map of Gallatin County bore hundreds of colored pins, each representing a potential sighting, a suspicious vehicle, or a location where Sarah might have been taken. Red pins marked confirmed sightings, blue indicated unverified reports, and yellow represented the growing collection of false leads that had broken Patricia's heart one by one. She could recite the coordinates of each pin from memory, along with the date, time, and witness who had provided the information. Patricia's annual vigils at the site where Sarah's car was found began as family gatherings, but evolved into community events that drew reporters from as far as Denver. Each February 14th, she arrived at County Road 86 with fresh flowers and battery-powered lanterns, her breath visible in the frigid air as she read aloud from the journal she'd kept since Sarah's disappearance. Local television stations initially covered these commemorations with sensitivity, but as years passed, Patricia noticed the reporters seemed younger, less invested, treating her daughter's story as an annual ritual rather than an ongoing investigation. The toll on her marriage revealed itself in small, incremental ways that Richard couldn't address directly. He stopped asking about her basement activities, learned to sleep through the sound of her footsteps on the floor above at 3 a.m, and eventually moved to the guest bedroom to avoid disturbing her when she returned to bed after hours of reviewing case files. Their conversations, once filled with discussion of Sarah's college plans and weekend activities, became functional exchanges about household maintenance and teaching schedules. Patricia's relationship with law enforcement cycled through phases of cooperation, frustration, and eventual antagonism. She called Sheriff Bradley weekly during the first year, bi-weekly during the second, and monthly for the 5 years that followed. When Bradley retired and was replaced by Sheriff Janet Carlson, Patricia hoped for renewed interest in the case. Instead, she encountered polite deflection and promises of review that never materialized into action. Her reputation within the department shifted from grieving mother to persistent nuisance, and deputies began avoiding her calls. The boxes in her basement multiplied as Patricia conducted her own interviews with anyone willing to talk. She drove hundreds of miles to speak with inmates who claimed knowledge of Sarah's fate, most of whom demanded money or cigarettes in exchange for information that proved worthless. She corresponded with psychics, private investigators, and amateur sleuths who contacted her through newspaper articles, carefully documenting each interaction in case it produced a genuine lead. By 2005, Patricia's obsession had isolated her from friends who could no longer tolerate conversations that inevitably returned to Sarah's case. Her sister Margaret, who had initially supported the investigation efforts, began avoiding holiday gatherings where Patricia would inevitably corner guests with theories and evidence. The woman who had once been known for her warmth and humor became a figure of sympathy and slight discomfort, someone people crossed the street to avoid encountering at the grocery store. The decades following Sarah Mitchell's disappearance created a gravitational pull for Montana's drifters, con artists, and attention seekers, each offering fragments of hope that crumbled under scrutiny. Detective Janet Carlson inherited a filing cabinet stuffed with false confessions, bogus sightings, and conspiracy theories that had consumed hundreds of investigative hours without advancing the case a single step forward. In 1992, a transient named Marcus Webb contacted the sheriff's department from a jail cell in Billings, claiming he'd witnessed Sarah's abduction while camping illegally near County Road 86. Webb's story contained enough specific details about the area and weather conditions to warrant a 2-day interrogation. He described a dark pickup truck with Montana plates and a driver wearing a baseball cap, details that seemed promising until investigators discovered Webb had been incarcerated in Wyoming on February 14, 1987. His information had come from newspaper coverage he'd memorized during previous jail stays. The emergence of the internet in the mid-1990s exponentially increased the volume of false leads. Amateur investigators with usernames like Montana Truth Seeker and Cold Case Expert flooded law enforcement with theories linking Sarah's disappearance to everything from human trafficking rings to satanic cults. One particularly persistent online sleuth spent 3 years trying to connect the case to a series of highway murders in Nevada, submitting hundreds of pages of analysis that demonstrated impressive research skills applied to completely irrelevant data. Robert "Bobby" Hutchins became the most convincing false suspect of the early 2000s. A former carnival worker with a history of assault charges, Hutchins had been in the Bozeman area during the winter of 1987, working temporary construction jobs and living in a trailer park on the outskirts of town. Multiple witnesses placed him at various bars and diners where Sarah had been seen, and his pattern of leaving towns abruptly after legal troubles created a suspicious timeline. The investigation into Hutchins consumed 8 months and substantial resources, including attempts to track his movements across 6 states. The case against him collapsed when investigators discovered his employer's payroll records, which proved he'd been working a night shift in Missoula on February 14th. Technology that promised to revolutionize criminal investigations brought its own disappointments. The introduction of CODIS, the FBI's DNA database, raised hopes that Sarah's case might finally yield answers through forensic science. Investigators submitted trace evidence from her abandoned vehicle for analysis, only to learn that the samples had deteriorated beyond usability due to improper storage techniques in the 1980s. Similarly, attempts to enhance audio recordings from 911 calls and witness interviews using digital technology revealed only background noise and conversations irrelevant to the investigation. The most heartbreaking false lead came in 2008 when construction workers discovered skeletal remains in a remote area of Highlight Canyon. Patricia Mitchell arrived at the scene before investigators could establish a perimeter, convinced after 21 years that her daughter's body had finally been found. The forensic anthropologist's determination that the remains belonged to a male victim, approximately 40 years old, at time of death left Patricia collapsed in her husband's arms. Grief compounded by the cruelty of raised and shattered hopes. Professional psychics contributed their own category of false leads, with individuals claiming everything from visions of Sarah trapped in underground chambers to communications from beyond the grave. Detective Carlson maintained files on 17 different psychic consultations, not because she believed in supernatural assistance, but because desperate families sometimes pursued these alternatives independently. The most elaborate psychic involvement occurred in 2010, when a self-proclaimed medium from California convinced Patricia to fund a week-long search of abandoned mine shafts based on detailed visions that proved entirely inaccurate. Each false lead exacted its own emotional toll on the Mitchell family and the investigating officers who pursued them. Detective Carlson learned to recognize the signs of fabricated evidence and coached Patricia on identifying the warning signs of deception. But hope remained a powerful motivator that overrode logical skepticism. The case file grew thicker with each debunked theory, creating a paper trail of human desperation that documented not just Sarah's disappearance, but a community's inability to accept that some questions might never receive answers. Earl Hutchinson had carried the weight of February 14, 1987 for 16 years, before lung cancer gave him the courage to speak what he'd never dared whisper. The 64-year-old mechanic who'd spent 4 decades under the hoods of pickup trucks and farm equipment had developed a reputation for reliability that made his final confession all the more devastating to those who heard it. Earl owned a small garage on the outskirts of Bozeman, the kind of operation where farmers brought equipment that larger shops wouldn't touch, and where handshake agreements carried more weight than written contracts. His workspace smelled of motor oil and coffee grounds, the concrete floor stained by decades of automotive fluids that told the story of every repair job he'd completed. The business had been profitable enough to support his wife Martha and their 3 children, but never prosperous enough to afford the kind of modernization that might have included security cameras or detailed appointment books. On the night Sarah Mitchell disappeared, Earl had been working late on a combine harvester that needed to be ready for spring planting. His garage sat approximately 2 miles from County Road 86, positioned at an angle that provided a clear view of the intersection where the county road met Highway 191. Earl had always been methodical about his work, taking breaks every few hours to step outside and clear his lungs of fumes, a habit that probably extended his life by several years despite his eventual diagnosis. During one of these breaks, sometime around 11:30 p.m., Earl noticed headlights moving along County Road 86 in an irregular pattern that caught his attention. The vehicle appeared to stop and start several times, behavior that seemed unusual for the straight stretch of road that most drivers navigated at steady speeds. Through the falling snow, he could distinguish the outline of what appeared to be a pickup truck, though the weather conditions made identifying specific details impossible. What happened next would replay in Earl's mind for the next 16 years. A second set of headlights appeared on the road, moving at a much higher speed toward the stopped vehicle. The approaching car appeared to be smaller, possibly a sedan or compact vehicle, and its erratic movement suggested either mechanical problems or driver distress. Earl watched the 2 vehicles converge, their headlight beams creating strange patterns in the swirling snow that reminded him of dancers moving across a stage. The interaction between the vehicles lasted no more than 3 or 4 minutes, but Earl's view became increasingly obscured by the intensifying snowfall. He could see movement around the vehicles, shadows that might have been people, but the distance and weather conditions made identifying specific actions impossible. When the snow cleared momentarily, only one set of headlights remained visible, and that vehicle departed in the direction of town at what appeared to be normal speed. Earl had intended to mention the incident to Sheriff Bradley the next day, but the discovery of Sarah's abandoned Honda on the same stretch of road transformed his observation from curious incident to potential evidence in a criminal investigation. The weight of that realization paralyzed him with fear and uncertainty about what he might have witnessed. Earl understood that his testimony could identify him as the only witness to whatever had happened on County Road 86, potentially making him a target for whoever had been involved. As the investigation focused on Danny Kowalski and other suspects with obvious connections to Sarah, Earl convinced himself that his distant observation couldn't contribute meaningful evidence to the case. He rationalized his silence by noting the poor visibility conditions and his inability to identify specific individuals or license plates. The longer he waited to come forward, the more difficult it became to explain his initial hesitation. Detective Carlson received Earl's phone call on October 15, 2003, 3 weeks after his cancer diagnosis, and 2 days after his doctor had given him an estimated 6 months to live. His voice shook as he explained what he'd seen that night, interrupted by coughing fits that punctuated his confession with reminders of his mortality. Carlson immediately drove to the garage. Finding Earl sitting in the same chair where he'd watched Sarah's final moments without understanding their significance. Earl died on December 3, 2003, before investigators could arrange the detailed interview session that might have extracted additional details from his memory. His death closed the most promising lead the case had generated in over a decade, leaving investigators with a partial account that raised more questions than it answered. Detective Lisa Chen arrived in Bozeman during the summer of 2019 with a background in cold case investigations and a master's degree in forensic science that made her uniquely qualified to approach decades-old evidence with fresh perspective. The 38-year-old former Seattle police investigator had requested assignment to Montana specifically because she wanted to work complex cases in a smaller department where individual efforts could make significant impact. Chen's first meeting with the Sarah Mitchell case files occurred in the basement evidence room of the Gallatin County Sheriff's Department, where cardboard boxes from the 1980s sat alongside more recent digital storage systems. The evidence storage protocols of 1987 bore little resemblance to contemporary forensic standards, and Chen quickly realized that much of the potential DNA evidence had been compromised by improper handling and storage conditions that reflected the technological limitations of the era. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. While examining photographs of Sarah's abandoned Honda, Chen noticed that crime scene technicians in 1987 had collected a coffee cup from the vehicle's cup holder, apparently assuming it belonged to Sarah. The cup had been stored in a paper evidence bag and forgotten for 32 years, its potential significance overlooked by investigators who lacked access to DNA analysis technology. Chen submitted the coffee cup to the Montana State Crime Lab with a request for expedited processing, understanding that trace amounts of saliva might have survived despite the evidence's age. The lab's response arrived 6 weeks later with results that transformed the investigation's trajectory. The cup contained DNA from 2 individuals, one profile matching Sarah Mitchell's known DNA from her hairbrush, and a second profile from an unknown male subject. The unknown DNA profile was entered into CODIS, the FBI's combined DNA index system, which compared the genetic markers against millions of profiles from convicted criminals, missing persons, and unsolved cases across the United States. The initial search produced no matches, indicating that Sarah's abductor had never been arrested for a felony crime that required DNA submission, or had committed the crime before mandatory DNA collection became standard practice. Chen understood that traditional investigative methods had reached their limits with the Sarah Mitchell case, and she began exploring advanced forensic techniques that had emerged during the previous decade. Forensic genetic genealogy represented a revolutionary approach to cold case investigation, using commercial DNA databases to identify suspects through their genetic relationships to distant relatives who had submitted DNA samples for ancestry research. The process required extracting every available molecule of genetic material from the coffee cup and employing specialized laboratory techniques to amplify degraded DNA samples. Chen worked with a private laboratory in Virginia that specialized in forensic genealogy, submitting the unknown male's DNA profile for comparison against genealogy databases containing millions of consumer genetic profiles. The genealogy analysis consumed 4 months of computer processing and genetic analysis, during which Chen continued investigating other aspects of the case while waiting for results that might finally identify Sarah's abductor. The technique involved constructing family trees for genetic matches and using demographic information to narrow potential suspects based on age, geographic location, and other factors relevant to the 1987 timeframe. When the genealogy results arrived in Chen's email inbox on January 23, 2020, they contained information that would shatter Bozeman's understanding of the Sarah Mitchell case. The unknown DNA profile matched genetic markers associated with the Hendricks family tree, specifically indicating a connection to William Hendricks, the elementary school crossing guard who had lived in Bozeman since 1975 and maintained a reputation as one of the community's most trusted figures. Chen spent the following weeks conducting surveillance on Hendricks, while building a case that could withstand legal scrutiny. The investigation required collecting comparative DNA samples through discarded coffee cups and cigarette butts, confirming the genetic match through multiple independent tests and establishing Hendricks' opportunity to commit the crime through historical records and witness interviews. The evidence connecting William Hendricks to Sarah Mitchell's disappearance extended beyond DNA. Employment records showed that Hendricks had worked as a night janitor at the high school in 1987, a position that would have made him familiar with Sarah's schedule and activities. His access to school buildings and grounds provided opportunities to observe potential victims, and his trusted position in the community had allowed him to operate without suspicion for over 3 decades. The forensic genealogy analysis that would ultimately solve Sarah Mitchell's case began with a single genetic marker match in a database containing over 20 million DNA profiles from ancestry enthusiasts who had unknowingly contributed to criminal investigations. Dr. Rebecca Torres, the forensic genealogist working with Detective Chen, explained that the process resembled assembling a vast jigsaw puzzle where most pieces remained missing, but enough fragments existed to glimpse the complete picture. The initial match connected the unknown male DNA to a woman named Margaret Hendricks, who had submitted her genetic profile to trace her family's Irish immigrant roots 3 years earlier. Margaret's DNA indicated a familial relationship, consistent with the unknown subject being her brother, uncle, or male cousin, a connection that provided the first concrete lead in the case since Earl Hutchinson's deathbed confession 17 years earlier. Dr. Torres began constructing what genealogists call a mirror tree, building family networks around Margaret Hendricks by cross-referencing birth records, marriage certificates, and census data spanning 4 generations. The work required accessing archives from 3 states and coordinating with genealogy researchers who specialized in Montana family histories. Each branch of the family tree needed verification through multiple independent sources before investigators could consider potential suspects. The Hendricks family had arrived in Montana during the 1940s, part of the post-war migration that brought thousands of families west in search of economic opportunities and open spaces. Margaret's grandfather, Thomas Hendricks, had worked for the railroad until his retirement in 1968, establishing a family presence in the region that had grown to include dozens of relatives scattered across the state by the time Sarah Mitchell disappeared. Detective Chen found herself studying family photographs that Margaret had uploaded to her ancestry profile, examining the faces of men who might have been in the Bozeman area during February 1987. The images created an eerie sensation of hunting for a killer among birthday parties, wedding celebrations, and holiday gatherings where relatives smiled at cameras without knowing they were providing evidence for a future murder investigation. The genealogy research revealed 5 potential male suspects within the appropriate age range and geographic proximity to have committed the crime. Chen systematically eliminated candidates based on alibis, medical records indicating physical limitations, and confirmed deaths before 1987. The process consumed weeks of meticulous investigation, during which Chen felt the weight of potentially being closer to solving Sarah's disappearance than any investigator in 34 years. William Thomas Hendricks emerged as the primary suspect, through a combination of genetic analysis and biographical details that aligned disturbingly well with the crime's circumstances. Born in 1952, he would have been 35 years old during Sarah's disappearance, placing him within the age range that criminal psychologists associated with this type of predatory behavior. His employment history showed a pattern of positions that provided access to young people and their schedules, including his work as a night janitor at Bozeman High School during the 1980s. The revelation that Hendricks had cleaned the same hallways Sarah walked, had access to student schedules and personal information, and possessed keys to virtually every building in the school district created a profile that explained how he might have selected and stalked his victim. Chen discovered that Hendrix's janitorial duties had included emptying trash cans in the guidance counselor's office, where student employment information was often discarded, potentially providing him with details about Sarah's work schedule at Rosie's diner. Chen's investigation into Hendrix's background revealed a carefully constructed facade of community involvement and respectability that had allowed him to hide in plain sight for over 3 decades. After leaving his position at the high school in 1991, he had transitioned to working with elementary school children as a crossing guard, a role that reinforced his image as a protective figure while providing continued access to potential victims. The genetic evidence linking Hendrix to Sarah's case was scientifically conclusive, but Chen understood that successful prosecution would require building a comprehensive case that could withstand defense challenges. She began conducting covert surveillance of Hendrix while researching his activities and whereabouts during other unsolved cases involving young women in Montana, suspecting that Sarah Mitchell might not have been his only victim. The weight of discovering that Sarah's killer had spent decades working around children, trusted by parents and school administrators, conducting his normal life while Patricia Mitchell descended into her basement each night to search for answers, created an emotional burden that Chen struggled to process. The randomness of genetic genealogy, dependent on a relative's decision to research family history, highlighted how many cold cases might remain forever unsolved due to the absence of such coincidental evidence. The surveillance photographs that Detective Chen spread across her desk on February 28, 2021, captured William Hendrix in the ordinary moments that had defined his public persona for 46 years in Bozeman. Here he stood outside Roosevelt Elementary at 7:15 a.m., orange safety vest, reflecting the morning sunlight as second graders crossed North 7th Avenue under his watchful protection. There he sat on his front porch, reading the Bozeman Daily Chronicle while his coffee steamed in the crisp mountain air. Each image documented the life of a man whose neighbors considered him a pillar of community safety and reliability. Hendrix had lived in the same modest blue ranch house on Elm Street since 1979, maintaining a lawn that neighborhood children used as a shortcut to school, and a garden that produced tomatoes he shared with elderly neighbors every August. His mailbox bore a faded Montana State University sticker, and his pickup truck displayed a parking permit for the elementary school where he'd worked faithfully for 15 years. To anyone observing his daily routine, William Hendrix appeared to embody the values of small-town responsibility and civic engagement. The psychological profile that Chen commissioned from the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit painted a disturbing picture of compartmentalization and calculated deception. Hendrix represented a category of offender that investigators found particularly challenging: individuals who constructed elaborate facades of normalcy while harboring predatory behaviors that remained hidden from even their closest associates. His ability to maintain employment around children while concealing his criminal nature suggested a level of self-control and manipulation that had allowed him to avoid detection for over 3 decades. Chen's investigation revealed that Hendrix had deliberately cultivated relationships with law enforcement officers over the years, often stopping by the sheriff's department to deliver holiday cookies baked by his wife Dorothy, or to chat about traffic safety concerns around the elementary school. Several deputies considered him a friend, making his eventual arrest emotionally devastating for the men and women who had worked alongside him during community events and safety programs. The discovery that Hendrix had been present during some of the early searches for Sarah Mitchell added another layer of horror to his profile. Volunteer search records from February 1987 listed him among the dozens of community members who had combed through snow-covered fields calling Sarah's name, knowing exactly where her body lay while participating in the effort to find her. Chen located photographs from those searches, showing Hendricks among the searchers, his face displaying what witnesses had interpreted as genuine concern, but which now appeared as the satisfied expression of a killer observing the chaos he had created. Dorothy Hendricks, who had been married to William for 42 years, would later tell investigators that she had never suspected her husband's involvement in any criminal activity. Her shock and disbelief reflected the successful manipulation that had characterized their entire relationship, during which William had presented himself as a devoted husband and community member while concealing urges and behaviors that would have horrified her. Dorothy's statements revealed a marriage built on careful performance rather than genuine intimacy, with William maintaining strict control over information about his whereabouts and activities. The revelation that Sarah Mitchell's killer had spent decades working around children created panic among parents who had trusted their most vulnerable family members to his care. Hundreds of families faced the terrifying realization that they had encouraged their children to trust and obey a man who had murdered a young woman, maintained her grave's location as his secret, and continued his normal life while her family suffered decades of unanswered questions. Chen discovered that Hendricks had volunteered for numerous youth organizations over the years, including Little League Baseball, church youth groups, and summer camp programs. His personnel files contained glowing recommendations from supervisors and colleagues who had observed his interactions with children and found them appropriately professional and caring. The disconnect between his public persona and his criminal nature illustrated the sophisticated level of deception that had enabled his decades of freedom. The arrest itself, captured on body camera footage that would later be played in court, showed Hendricks offering no resistance or surprise when Detective Chen approached him in the school parking lot. His calm demeanor suggested either complete confidence in his ability to avoid prosecution or resignation to the inevitability of being caught after 34 years of wondering when genetic technology might finally expose him. Parents who had watched Hendricks guide their children safely across busy intersections, who had waved to him from car windows and invited him to school functions, struggled to reconcile the protective figure they knew with the predator who had torn apart the Mitchell family. His betrayal of community trust represented a violation that extended far beyond his crime against Sarah, encompassing every family who had believed their children were safe under his protection. The interrogation room at the Gallatin County Sheriff's Department had witnessed countless confessions over the decades, but the quiet, methodical manner in which William Hendricks dismantled 34 years of lies created an atmosphere that veteran investigators would later describe as uniquely disturbing. Detective Chen sat across from Hendricks at a metal table scarred by decades of use, the fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows that emphasized the deep lines around his eyes, lines that she now understood had been carved by years of carrying Sarah Mitchell's murder as his secret burden. Hendricks had waived his right to an attorney with the same matter-of-fact demeanor he'd displayed when setting up traffic cones each morning, explaining to Chen that he'd been expecting this conversation for over 3 decades and saw no point in prolonging the inevitable. His hands remained steady as he reached for the paper cup of coffee that Chen had provided, and his voice carried the same calm tone that hundreds of children had learned to associate with safety and protection. The confession began with February 14, 1987, but Hendricks' account revealed that Sarah Mitchell's murder had been the culmination of months of planning and observation, rather than a spontaneous act of violence. His position as night janitor at Bozeman High School had provided access to student records, work-study program information, and scheduling details that allowed him to study potential victims with the patience of a predator who understood that successful hunting required extensive preparation. Hendricks explained that he'd first noticed Sarah during a basketball game in January 1987 when his janitorial duties had required him to clean the gymnasium after the event. Something about her laugh, he told Chen, had triggered fantasies that began with observation and escalated to detailed planning over the following weeks. He'd learned her work schedule by timing his drives past Rosie's diner, noting when her car appeared in the employee parking area and calculating the routes she might take home after her shifts ended. The actual abduction had been simpler than Hendricks had anticipated. He'd positioned his pickup truck on County Road 86, blocking Sarah's path home with the hood raised to simulate mechanical problems. When she'd stopped to offer assistance, a gesture of kindness that reflected the small-town values her parents had instilled, Hendricks had used a tire iron to render her unconscious before loading her into his vehicle. The entire encounter had lasted less than 3 minutes, executed with the efficiency of someone who'd rehearsed every detail multiple times. Chen listened with professional detachment as Hendricks described transporting Sarah to an abandoned mine shaft, approximately 27 miles northeast of Bozeman, a location he'd selected during reconnaissance trips that had taken him throughout Gallatin County's remote areas. The mine shaft, part of a copper extraction operation that had been abandoned in the 1940s, provided the isolation and concealment that Hendricks required for what he described as extended interaction with his victim. The psychological evaluation that followed Hendricks' confession revealed a complex pathology that had remained hidden beneath his carefully constructed public persona. Dr. Amanda Foster, the forensic psychologist who interviewed Hendricks over 6 sessions, documented evidence of narcissistic personality disorder combined with psychopathic traits that had enabled him to compartmentalize his criminal behavior while maintaining normal relationships and employment. His ability to function effectively in social and professional settings while harboring violent fantasies represented a level of psychological sophistication that had made detection virtually impossible through traditional investigative methods. Hendricks' description of the days following Sarah's murder revealed the calculated manner in which he'd integrated himself into the community's response to her disappearance. His participation in search efforts had provided emotional satisfaction and practical intelligence about the investigation's progress, allowing him to monitor law enforcement activities while appearing to support the family he'd devastated. He'd attended Patricia Mitchell's annual vigils for 12 years, standing among the mourners while knowing exactly where Sarah's remains lay hidden. The location of Sarah's body, which Hendricks revealed with the same methodical precision he'd applied to everything else, would require specialized recovery equipment and forensic experts trained in excavating human remains from confined spaces. Chen understood that bringing Sarah home to her family would represent both closure and a final devastating confirmation of the violence she'd endured during her final hours. The courtroom, where William Hendricks entered his guilty plea on September 18, 2021, contained every seat filled with members of a community struggling to reconcile 34 years of misplaced trust with the horrific reality of Sarah Mitchell's murder. Patricia Mitchell sat in the front row, her hands folded in her lap, with the same precise arrangement she'd used when organizing evidence in her basement, finally witnessing the moment she'd imagined countless times during her decades of obsessive investigation. Judge Margaret Thompson had presided over hundreds of criminal cases during her 20-year judicial career, but the weight of Hendricks's confession and its implications for community safety created an atmosphere unlike anything she'd previously experienced. The man who stood before her bench had been trusted with the lives of thousands of children, had participated in community events designed to promote safety and security, and had maintained his facade of respectability while knowing exactly what he'd done to Sarah Mitchell and her family. The victim impact statements that preceded Hendricks' sentencing revealed the devastating ripple effects that his crime had created throughout Bozeman's social fabric. Patricia Mitchell's statement, delivered in the same controlled voice she'd used during decades of media interviews, described the destruction of her marriage, the loss of relationships with friends and family members who'd grown tired of her obsession, and the transformation of her basement into a shrine to investigative futility that had consumed the majority of her adult life. Richard Mitchell, who had rarely spoken publicly about his daughter's disappearance, described the gradual erosion of hope that had characterized his experience as Sarah's father. His statement revealed the private anguish of a man who'd watched his wife disappear into her investigation while struggling with his own grief and the practical demands of maintaining a household where normal life had become impossible. The divorce papers that Richard and Patricia had signed 2 months after Hendricks' arrest represented the final casualty of a crime that had destroyed their family in ways extending far beyond Sarah's death. Dorothy Hendricks faced her own devastating reckoning with the revelation of her husband's true nature. Her written statement to the court described 42 years of marriage to a man she'd never actually known, the horrifying realization that she'd shared a bed with Sarah's murderer, and the ongoing investigation into whether other unsolved cases might be connected to Williams' activities. The FBI's review of cold cases involving young women in Montana had identified 14 potential connections that would require years of investigation to resolve. The parents whose children had trusted Hendricks as their crossing guard struggled with questions that would never receive satisfactory answers. How many mornings had their daughters and sons walked past a killer while their parents waved gratefully from car windows? What conversations had Hendricks had with their children during his years of supervising their safe passage to school? The revelation that several families had invited Hendricks to birthday parties and school events created a secondary trauma that extended his victim count far beyond Sarah Mitchell. Detective Chen's investigation had solved Sarah's case, but it had also revealed the limitations of background checks and screening procedures that had allowed Hendricks to work around children for decades without raising suspicions. The elementary school district implemented new policies requiring psychological evaluations and enhanced background investigations for all employees who interacted with students, changes that came too late to protect the children who'd already been exposed to Hendricks's access and manipulation. The sentencing phase concluded with Judge Thompson's imposition of life imprisonment without possibility of parole, a decision that provided legal closure while failing to address the broader questions about community vulnerability and institutional failure that Hendricks' case had exposed. His crime had demonstrated how effectively predators could hide within positions of trust and respect, using community involvement and civic responsibility as camouflage for activities that violated every principle they appeared to represent. The media coverage that followed Hendricks' conviction brought unwanted attention to Bozeman from true crime enthusiasts and amateur investigators who arrived seeking to explore locations connected to Sarah's case. The Mitchell family found themselves dealing with a new category of intrusion as their private tragedy became the subject of podcasts, documentaries, and online discussions that treated Sarah's murder as entertainment rather than the devastating loss of a young woman whose potential would never be realized. For those who followed this case from the beginning, Sarah Mitchell's story serves as a reminder that justice, when it finally arrives, often brings as many questions as answers. If you've been following along with this investigation, consider subscribing to stay informed about other cold cases that deserve attention, and share your thoughts about how communities can better protect themselves from predators who hide behind facades of respectability and trust.